The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the desert air as the casualties flooded into the field hospital. Dust swirled through the canvas tent, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp antiseptic bite of medical supplies hastily deployed. The ambush had been brutally coordinated attack that caught the convoy off guard on a supply run that was supposed to be routine. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thorne surveyed the chaos with the confident air of a man who'd been through this drill 100 times before. At 38, he was the senior corpsman on duty, his uniform crisp despite the circumstances, his voice cutting through the groans of wounded men like a drill sergeant's bark. He moved between cots with practiced efficiency, barking orders at the younger medics who scrambled to keep pace with his demands. Johnson, get that plasma started. Rivera, pressure on that femoral bleed. Move, people, we don't have all day. His words carried the weight of authority earned through years of service, though those who'd served longer might have noticed. It was more theater than substance, the performance of competence, rather than its quiet reality. In the corner, on a blood-stained cot pushed almost against the tent wall, lay a woman. Her desert fatigues were torn and darkened with her own blood, a significant shrapnel wound visible through the shredded fabric near her ribs. Her face was pale beneath a layer of grime and sweat, her dark hair matted against her forehead. She wore no rank insignia, no unit patch, nothing that identified her as anything other than what Thorne immediately assumed her to be, another contractor. He muttered to a young Navy corpsman assisting him, loud enough for the woman to hear if she'd been conscious enough to care. Probably got spooked during the attack and ran right into the kill zone. They never learn. Give me a standard for Kit and get her name for the casualty report. The younger medic nodded, his eyes barely touching the still form on the cot before moving on. In the hierarchy of triage, she was stable enough to wait, not critical, not dying in the next few minutes, and therefore not a priority when others were screaming for help. The woman said nothing. Her breathing was shallow but controlled, her gray eyes startlingly clear despite the pain etched in the lines around them fixed. On the canvas ceiling above, there was no protest, no correction of Thorne's dismissive assumption, no request for faster treatment, just silence, the profound kind of silence that speaks volumes to those trained to listen. Though Thorne heard none of it, what he failed to notice was the deliberate placement of her hands, not clutching her wound in agony but resting with calculated precision near her torso. He didn't see the mathematical rhythm of her breathing, each breath measured and controlled despite the obvious pain. He missed entirely the way her eyes tracked every sound, every movement in the tent, building a complete tactical picture of her environment even as blood seeped slowly through her field dressing. Across the tent, a young Marine barely 20, his face still holding traces of teenage softness beneath the grime of combat, began to convulse. His name was Danny Reeves, a rifleman on his second deployment, and his breathing had been getting progressively worse since they'd brought him in with what they'd thought was a simple shoulder wound. He's crashing, shouted Corpsman Rivera, a rookie on his first deployment. His airway is closing, I think it's angioedema. Thorne spun around, his carefully maintained composure fracturing at the edges. Angioedema, severe swelling of the throat, likely an allergic reaction to something, possibly the antibiotics they'd administered. It could close off a patient's airway in minutes, and without immediate intervention, the Marine would suffocate despite being in a room full of medical professionals. Crikit now, Thorne barked, his voice rising an octave. Emergency cricothyrotomy. People, let's move. A junior medic thrust the sterile package into his hands. Thorne tore it open, his fingers suddenly feeling thick and clumsy. The young Marine's face was transitioning from red to a dusky purple, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a man unable to breathe. Thorne positioned the scalpel over the throat, his hand hovering as he tried to recall the exact anatomical landmarks. The cricothyroid membrane between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage is a small target, maybe 3/4 of an inch tall. Cut too high and you hit the vocal cords, too low and you risk the trachea. He'd practiced this on dummies a dozen times in training, but that had been years ago, and dummies didn't have faces or families or futures hanging in the balance. His hand trembled. He pressed the blade to skin, then hesitated. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The Marine's lips were turning blue. His chest heaved in desperate, futile attempts to draw air through a closing windpipe. The seconds stretched into an eternity of indecision. That's when the woman moved. There was no dramatic surge, no sudden jerking motion. Instead, she pushed herself up on one elbow with a fluid precision that seemed impossible. Given her injury, her left hand moved to the small of her back, beneath her shredded shirt, and emerged holding something that made every experienced operator in the tent instinctively recognize they'd misjudged everything. The knife was like nothing issued in any military supply catalog. Its blade was perhaps 5 inches long, crafted from dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The edge gleamed with the kind of sharpness that could only be achieved through countless hours of meticulous maintenance. The handle was wrapped in worn paracord, molded by years of a consistent, practiced grip. This was not a weapon. This was an instrument, a tool refined to perfect purpose by a master craftsman. She swung her legs off the cot, ignoring the fresh blood that immediately began to seep through her dressing. 3 steps, each one measured and purposeful. Despite the obvious, pain brought her to the young Marine's side. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce her intentions. She simply acted with the kind of absolute certainty that comes only from having performed a task so many times that it transcends conscious thought and becomes pure muscle memory. Her left hand steady as stone despite her own trauma touched the Marine's throat with a surgeon's delicacy. Her fingertips found the landmarks instantly. The hard prominence of the thyroid cartilage, the small indentation below it, the cricoid ring beneath that. The cricothyroid membrane lay between them, a tiny window of opportunity perhaps 20 millimeters tall. The blade moved in her right hand. Not a cut, not a slash, but a single horizontal incision of such precision, it seemed almost gentle. The membrane parted under the edge like silk. A second motion equally controlled widened the opening. Then a soft hiss of air, followed by a gasping rush as the Marine's lungs finally filled. The dusky blue faded from his face. His chest began to rise and fall in ragged but functional breaths. Life, which had been slipping away under the hesitant hands of procedures and protocols, had been snatched back by someone who understood that in the space between heartbeats, theory means nothing and action means everything. The woman withdrew the blade, wiped it once on a sterile gauze, and laid it carefully on the medical tray beside the Marine. Then, without a word, she turned and walked the 3 steps back to her cot. She lay down, closed her eyes, and resumed the shallow, controlled breathing of someone conserving every ounce of energy. The tent had fallen into absolute silence. Thorne stood frozen, his own scalpel still poised uselessly over a procedure he'd failed to perform. He stared at the perfect incision, at the strange black blade resting on the tray, at the woman who had just casually demonstrated the difference between training and mastery. What he began, but his voice died in his throat. That's when Commander James Blackwood entered the tent. At 56, Blackwood had spent more than 3 decades in the Navy. He'd served in the First Gulf War, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. He'd commanded a SEAL team, run a training facility, and seen the full spectrum of human capability under fire. There was very little that surprised him anymore, but there was still plenty that commanded his respect. His eyes swept the tent, the wounded men, the exhausted medics, the tableau of Thorne standing, paralyzed over a Marine, who was now breathing freely thanks to someone else's intervention. Then his gaze settled on the woman lying quietly on the corner cot, and on the blade resting on the tray beside young Reeves. Blackwood's weathered face went very still. He walked slowly across the tent, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't acknowledge any of the other personnel. His entire focus was on that knife. He reached down and picked it up, holding it the way a museum curator might hold an ancient artifact. He turned it over in his hands, examining the unusual metal, the perfect balance, the worn paracord wrapping that spoke of countless hours of use. His thumb traced along the spine of the blade, not testing its sharpness but feeling its presence, its history. "A phantom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone in the suddenly silent tent. "I haven't seen one of these since Helmand Province, 2011. He looked at the woman on the cot, who had opened her eyes and was watching him with those startling gray eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, no anxiety about being discovered, just a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of one professional by another. Blackwood turned to his aide, a young lieutenant who'd followed him into the tent. "Get me the Zipper terminal. Encrypted. Priority access." 3 minutes later, the ruggedized secure computer was in his hands. His fingers thick and calloused from years of hard use moved across the keyboard with surprising dexterity. He entered a series of passwords that bypassed the standard personnel databases, that went deeper than service records or security clearances, into the black archives where the military keeps its most closely guarded secrets. The tent held its collective breath. Even the wounded seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding. Information scrolled across the screen, visible only to Blackwood, but he began to read selected portions aloud, his voice carrying the weight of earned authority. Personnel file, classification level, top secret, special access required. Name, redacted. Operational cal sign, echo. He paused, letting the name settle into the space. Primary unit assignment, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Task Force Chimera. Someone in the tent sucked in a sharp breath. Task Force Chimera was barely even a rumor-deniable operations group that officially didn't exist, composed of operators pulled from the most elite units and given missions that would never appear in any congressional briefing. Blackwood continued reading, his voice steady but tinged with unmistakable respect. Active combat deployments, 53. Special qualifications, Special Operations Combat Medic Level 4. Advanced Trauma Life Support Instructor. Close Quarters Combat Master Instructor. High Altitude Low Opening Jump Qualified. Combat Diving Supervisor. The list went on, a litany of skills and certifications that represented decades of training and experience, compressed into one unassuming person. Combat citations and awards. Blackwood's voice caught for just a fraction of a second. Navy Cross with Valor Device. 2 Silver Stars. For Bronze Stars with Valor Device. 7 Purple Hearts. Presidential Unit Citation. He stopped reading. The numbers spoke for themselves. They painted a picture of someone who had been in more combat than most infantry battalions, who had been wounded and had returned to duty again and again, who had been recognized for extraordinary heroism multiple times in situations where the full truth would never be publicly acknowledged. Commander Blackwood, a man who had not saluted anyone below the rank of admiral in more than 5 years, straightened to attention. His hand came up in a crisp, formal salute, the kind of gesture reserved for the highest respect between warriors. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion that years of military discipline couldn't quite suppress. "Please accept my sincere apologies for the reception you received at my facility. It was unacceptable." The woman Echo looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave the slightest nod, an acknowledgement that required no words. She understood that Blackwood's apology was not personal but institutional, a recognition that somewhere in the chain of assumption and protocol, the system had failed to recognize one of its most capable operators. "Get her to the surgical suite," Blackwood ordered, his command voice returning. "Priority 1. I want our best trauma surgeon on this, and I want a private recovery room set up. Full security protocol." As the medics scrambled to prepare the transfer, Blackwood turned to Thorne, who still stood frozen, his face pale with the dawning realization of his mistake. "Chief Petty Officer Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice now cold as winter steel. "My office, 1 hour. We need to discuss your triage protocols and your habit of making assumptions about people you don't know." The story of what happened in that tent spread through the base like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, every soldier, sailor, and Marine knew some version of the tale. The details varied in the telling. Some versions had Echo saving 3 men instead of 1. Others had her performing a procedure while still lying on her cot, but the core truth remained consistent. The quiet contractor everyone had dismissed had turned out to be a legend in flesh and blood. In the barracks, in the mess hall, in the quiet spaces between duty shifts, soldiers who'd spent years in service found themselves reconsidering their own assumptions about competence and capability. The story became a touchstone, a reminder that real skill doesn't announce itself with fanfare or credentials worn on sleeves. For Thorne, the transformation was immediate and profound. He spent that hour before meeting Blackwood sitting alone in the latrine, his head in his hands, replaying every dismissive word, every assumption, every moment of casual arrogance. He thought about the Marine who would have died if Echo hadn't been there, if she hadn't possessed the skill and will to act when he had frozen. The meeting with Blackwood was brief and devastating. The commander didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply laid out, in precise and clinical terms, how Thorne's assumptions had nearly cost a young man his life, and how the only thing standing between that outcome and tragedy had been the presence of someone Thorne had judged unworthy of his attention. "You're a good corpsman, Thorne," Blackwood said at the end. "You have solid technical skills, but you've let those skills make you arrogant, and arrogance in our profession kills people. The question now is whether you're capable of learning from this, or whether this is the high point of your career." 3 days later, when Echo was stable enough for visitors, Thorne requested permission to see her. He stood at the foot of her bed in the private recovery room, stripped of his earlier swagger, humbled to his core. For a long moment, he couldn't find words adequate to the situation. "Ma'am," he finally said, the honorific feeling both foreign and absolutely right. "I need you to know that I was wrong about everything. There's no excuse for how I treated you, for the assumptions I made. You saved that Marine's life when I couldn't, and you did it while wounded yourself. I wanted to thank you, and to apologize, and to say that I'm going to do better. I have to do better." Echo studied him with those piercing gray eyes. She didn't speak. Her medical chart indicated she'd been advised to minimize talking to let her injuries heal, but after a moment, she gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, necessarily, but acknowledgement, recognition that the lesson had been received. Thorne left that room a different man than he'd entered it. Over the following weeks and months, his colleagues noticed the change. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet professionalism that echoed, if only faintly, the example set by the woman they now knew as Echo. He began to listen more and assume less. He started treating every patient with the same care and respect, regardless of rank or uniform. He became a mentor to younger corpsmen, passing on not just technical skills but something more important, humility in the face of the unknown. Echo herself recovered and disappeared as quietly as she'd arrived. One day she was in the recovery room, the next she was gone, extracted by a helicopter that bore no unit markings and landed after midnight. Most of the base never saw her leave, but her presence remained, embedded in the culture of the facility. The Phantom Blade became legendary. Pilots debated whether it was made of some exotic classified alloy. Armorers discussed its perfect balance. But among the medical staff, it became a symbol of something else. The idea that competence doesn't advertise itself, that the most capable person in the room is often the quietest, that true strength is demonstrated through action rather than proclaimed through words. 6 months after the incident, a new class of corpsmen arrived at the base for their combat medicine rotation. Chief Petty Officer Thorne, now the senior instructor for field operations, gathered them in the same tent where Echo had performed her life-saving intervention. "Let me tell you a story," he began, and in his voice was none of the arrogance that had once defined him, only the hard-won wisdom of a man who had learned a crucial lesson the hardest way possible. "It's about the day I almost let a Marine die, because I was too busy making assumptions to recognize a master when she was lying, wounded 10 feet away from me." He told them about Echo, about the Phantom Blade, about the moment when his failure and her competence had collided in the space of a few desperate seconds. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. "Competence doesn't have a uniform," he concluded, his words now etched into the training curriculum of every corpsman who would pass through that base. "Skill doesn't announce itself. Courage doesn't wear rank. You will meet people in this career who seem unremarkable, who blend into the background, who never speak up or show off, and some of those people will be the most capable operators you'll ever encounter. Your job is not to judge them by appearance or assumption. Your job is to be ready to learn when they show you what true professionalism looks like." Years later, when Thorne retired after 24 years of service, he kept one item from his military career on display in his home. It wasn't a medal or a unit coin or a flag. It was a photograph, slightly grainy and taken without official permission, of a dark-bladed knife resting on a medical tray. Beneath it, he'd written in careful script, "The Phantom," a reminder that true strength is silent, and that the loudest voice in the room is often the emptiest. The legend of Echo became part of the base's institutional memory, passed down from one rotation to the next, a story that carried weight, because it was true and because it contained a lesson that every service member needed to learn, that real professionals don't need to prove themselves, that competence speaks through action rather than proclamation, and that sometimes the person you least expect carries within them the skills and courage that will save your life. In the quiet corners of military social media, in the forums where operators, past and present, share stories that never make the official records, Echo's name occasionally surfaces, always with respect, always with that particular reverence reserved for those who have walked through fire so many times that they've transcended the need for recognition, who have nothing left to prove to anyone because they've already proven everything that matters to themselves, and somewhere, perhaps sitting quietly in another anonymous assignment, another crisis waiting to unfold, Echo continues her work. The phantom blade rides in its worn sheath against the small of her back, ready for the moment when silence must give way to action, when competence must override chaos, when life hangs in the balance, and only skill and will can tip the scales towards survival. Because that's what true professionals do. They don't wait for recognition. They don't announce their presence. They simply show up, stay ready, and when the moment demands it, they act with a precision and certainty that needs no introduction and accepts no compromise. The lesson of the phantom blade lives on. True strength doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It doesn't seek credit or recognition. It simply exists, coiled and ready, until the moment when everything hangs in the balance. And then, without fanfare or hesitation, it does what must be done. That is the legacy of Echo. That is the power of silent competence. That is the truth that every young soldier, sailor, and Marine must learn. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least. And true worth is measured not in words spoken or ranks worn, but in lives saved when everything is on the line.